Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. Thank you for watching. In this video I want to talk a bit about Kant's theory of human nature, and I want to do so by thinking about his theory of human nature in the context of his groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. So hereafter I'll refer to that work as the groundwork. So I have other videos on the groundwork, so if you need some refreshing on those, feel free to watch them and return to this video, but I will say some things about them to recap some of the key ideas. So in Kant's groundwork, it's divided into three main sections. My video lectures on Kant are by and large on the first two sections. I think his theory of human nature comes out in the second and third sections dominantly, and so I want to say some things about how they do. So what I'm going to do in this video is just set the stage initially for thinking about Kant's theory of human nature by recapping the first two sections a little bit, and then turn more explicitly to Kant's theory of human nature as we find it in the groundwork. So the first section of the groundwork, Kant, he's engaged in the project of teaching us what the good will is. The good will turns out to be foundational to Kant's moral system. Kant claims that it's a thing that has unconditional value. It's the only thing that's good in every possible circumstance. Like its goodness is so good that it outweighs even the consequences intended by a will, and so it has this extremely high value in Kant's moral philosophy. So what does it mean to have a good will? Well, for Kant, to have a good will, to capture the view in a nutshell, is to have a will that's disposed to act for moral reasons. So it's a will, put in other terms, that's disposed to act for one's moral duty itself. So to give an example of this, Kant gives us several cases. I've discussed other cases in other videos, so I'll discuss a different one in this one. He gives us the example of someone who's fallen upon hard times. Let's call him the unfortunate man. Kant doesn't, but I do. Let's call him the unfortunate man. The unfortunate man is someone who has fallen upon hard times and he's considering suicide. So tell your favorite story as to why he's in such a state. Maybe he lost a loved one and feels indignant at the universe for this happening and wants to end his life accordingly. But Kant has us imagine this person not committing suicide for the reason that he has respect for his moral duty, which is to preserve his life. So it's in this case Kant tells us that we have an example of someone whose action has, we say, moral worth. Another way of putting that is we have an example of an action that is morally good. So when Kant develops the idea of a good will, he's trying to develop the idea of what a morally good will is. And this is supposed to serve as a kind of way of highlighting what a morally good will would be like. So this kind of case, in conjunction with other things Kant says, I think gives us reason to think that he thinks that a good will is a will that's disposed in terms of its character, guided by virtue, to behave in such a way. So it wouldn't just be like a one-time fluky thing, but it's the kind of thing that a will is disposed to do over time. So in order to maybe understand this case of the unfortunate man, think about the case of just people generally. People generally preserve their lives, and accordingly they live up to their duty. So you say to Kant, don't these people act morally correctly? They do the right thing as well. Well, Kant's going to say that in most cases people aren't acting for a moral reason. In most cases people are acting based on, say, some kind of self-love. The fact that they love themselves keeps people away from cars that might smash into them, or speedy bike riders on college campuses that might smash into them, and all the rest. So we tend to preserve our lives and thus live up to our duty, do the right thing. We're going to do the morally right thing in these kinds of cases because our reasons aren't guided, our actions, aren't guided by reasons which we would claim to be moral. So moral reason just is one's moral duty. And when people typically preserve their lives, their reason for acting doesn't involve doing so because it is the right thing to do or the moral thing to do. It's just because we're so inclined, because of our self-love, to do so. So hopefully those two cases help us see the difference, the moral difference between them that Kant wants us to see. Now you might be asking at this point, what about the duty that Kant has selected? He selected one that involves having one that involves preserving one's life. And you might say, well, what makes that a duty? Well, it's important to keep in mind with section 1 of the groundwork that Kant thinks that ordinary moral thinking is on pretty solid ground. So he thinks that he can take for granted in that first book what we ordinarily think about morality, and we ordinarily think that we have a duty to preserve our lives. At the very least, we think we have the duty not to preserve our lives. We have a duty to preserve our lives by not committing suicide. So, if that's right, it needs to be kept in mind that that first section is really Kant trying to explain the goodwill, thinking about what people ordinarily take to be true, morally speaking, without trying to do any kind of revisionist work about what the moral duties in fact are. Now, early on in the groundwork, even before section 1, in the introductory sections, Kant suggests that ordinary morality is on pretty secure footing, so he thinks he needs to put ordinary moral thinking on firm philosophical footing, lest moral skeptics think that moral duties don't hold and that morality is just a figment of our imagination, or lest someone try to say that we don't have the duties that we in fact do. So if you take issues with Kant assuming certain moral duties in the first section, I suggest don't, because he thinks that he can support those duties later. Now, there's going to be some issues with his attempt to do so later, but there may be nothing wrong with the practice of assuming certain morals just to get the project off the ground, and then to rationally support those moral standards later. The second section of the groundwork, Kant tries to give us the principle that he thinks governs all of our moral duties, the principle that we use to derive all of our moral duties, in fact. The principle is called famously the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is an imperative that holds for us no matter what. That's the categorical part of it. The imperative part of it means that it's a command. It's a command that morality requires of us. So the categorical imperative is the categorical imperative, given significance to it. It's the supreme principle of morality, the supreme principle of all obligation, as Kant would call it. And it's the thing that we need to follow at all costs. And so in order to understand it, Kant gives us several formulations and shows us how it works. The first formulation is called the formula of the universal law. And the basic idea behind this one is we think about a reason and what has to be true about our reason for acting. Think about the section 1, Kant tells us about what a good will is. A good will is one that acts for a morally good reason. Well, the basis of Kant's moral system is the idea that what makes an action a moral one is the reason that one has for acting. So his supreme principle of morality is going to be one that gives us certain conditions that can be satisfied in order for a reason to serve as a moral one. Okay, so the formula of the universal law: act for a reason that can be intended as a universal law. The basic idea here is our reason for acting has to be one that everyone can do in our circumstances. So we're to imagine particular cases that Kant gives us. Let's imagine the lying promiser case. It's a famous one. Kant imagines someone who needs money and intends to tell a lying promise in order to get that money. And Kant wants to teach us something about this case. He tells us, look, if we take that reason for acting and we ask ourselves, what would happen if everyone acted for this reason? A contradiction would result. The contradiction being that a world in which everyone tells lying promises when they need money is going to be one in which promising, the institution of promising, just collapses. So you're going to have a world where an individual is going to will to tell a lying promise, but they can't tell a lying promise because there's no such thing as promising. So that's how the formula of the universal law works, basically, is it provides a formal constraint on our reason for acting. Act for whatever reason you may. It's got to turn out to be, it's got to be true that your reason has to be universalizable, such that everyone could act for it without contradiction emerging. So that's the formula of the universal law, just in a nutshell. It's a formal constraint. The formula of humanity is the second way he formulates the formula of humanity, and that's always treat humanity as an end in itself and never merely as a means. And this basically means that you should treat human beings as rational beings, as those beings that have absolute worth, not merely instrumental worth, not merely the worth that would involve being used as an instrument in others' purposes, but having a kind of intrinsic moral worth that can have no price put on it. So is in this way infinite or absolute. So on this principle, what would make it wrong for someone to tell a lie and promise, according to Kant, is the fact that you're using an individual as a mere means for your purposes in order to get money, but you're not treating the individual as a rational being. And Kant seems to flesh out the idea here of treating someone as a mere means as treating someone in a way that they can't possibly consent to, because in this case you're withholding the relevant information from the individual. Okay, so that's just setting up for the last few minutes here that I'm going to talk about the Kant's theory of human nature. It's kind of been anticipated in thinking about the goodwill and thinking about the categorical imperative. So that was necessary recapping that happened there as we set the stage. So if you think about it, Kant is claiming that human beings have a kind of absolute worth. And that tells us something about human nature that Kant takes seriously about it. What is it that gives us our absolute worth, according to Kant? Well, it's our rationality, he ultimately thinks. It's in virtue belonging to a kingdom of rational beings, as he would put it later in the Groundwork, that we have the value that we in fact do. So on Kant's view, it's reason that really dominates the idea of human nature. And it's that reason that gives us the kind of value that we have. The infinite value that means that whenever we act, we have to always tailor our purposes carefully, so that way our purposes aren't conflicting with treating others as mere means to our ends, or put more positively, that our reasons for action, or the purposes within our reasons for action, always have to be tailored such that we treat people as rational beings with infinite value. So that teaches us quite a bit about Kant's theory of human nature. Now, of course, with the first section of the Groundwork, where we learn about the idea of the goodwill, Kant tells us about what a goodwill is, and it's a will that's disposed to act for moral reasons. Well, this tells us that according to Kant's view, we are moral beings, and that we have the capacity for acting morally, and we have the capacity for virtuously developing our will such that we're disposed to behave in accordance with morality. So we're rational, but we're also moral beings, and these are intimately connected. When we get to the third section, Kant, he feels the need to justify morality, and he wants to try to establish the possibility, of the categorical imperative. And there's debate about what that means, and maybe there's a bit of ambiguity in what Kant means by this. But ultimately what it boils down to, for Kant in that third section, it seems, and there's a bit of interpretive work going on here, is the idea that the categorical imperative is possible because it's possible that we're free. Now, it's sort of an interesting claim, because on Kant's view, he thinks that we can't establish metaphysically, theoretically, that we have free will. He thinks that reason struggles to prove either way. In a kind of principled way, it struggles. Meaning we're never going to arrive at the answer in trying to figure out whether or not we're free. But in order to act morally, Kant thinks we have to act freely. And so ultimately he thinks that he needs to put morality on proper foundations involving free will. He thinks he needs to say something about human free will in order to put the categorical imperative on firm philosophical footing. But he, in his metaphysics, has claimed that he can't establish that we are really free. So he says that we have to suffice for the claim that it's possible that we're free. So we can't prove nor disprove that we're free, but that means that it's open. The possibility that we're free is still open. And on Kant's view, that allows for the possibility of the categorical imperative, because the categorical imperative is a supreme principle of morality. So morality is possible because free will is possible. Now that may not be as satisfying as what you'd want, in a view that's trying to put morality on firm philosophical footing. But that's all Kant gives us. Thanks for watching, everybody.